Hey guys, it's Scarlett Maximoff here, and I'm just here to tell you that we are finally going to be reading, the Captain America book. Yay. So I'm going to be reading these on Fridays, and I'm going to be reading 3 chapters per Friday. So, let's stop talking and start reading. Captain America, the First Avenger. Okay. And I literally just finished reading this today, so, Chapter 1. Steve Rogers stood nervously in line at the recruitment center in Bayonne, New Jersey. Ahead of him, men stepped up one by one, they got approved to join the army. Steve sighed and waited for his turn, which seemed as if it would never come. Looking around, he noticed several newspaper headlines about brutal attacks on a small Norwegian town that had left civilians hurt and homeless. America was at war. Across the ocean, Europe was full of gunfire and explosions. Men, women, and children were losing their lives in their homes as enemy forces invaded country after country. It had been going on for 2 years before America got involved, but then Pearl Harbor happened. Now soldiers from the United States were flooding Europe, hoping to help the good guys win. But it wasn't going to be easy or a short fight. Steve felt a now familiar rush of anger and frustration. He wanted to be over there fighting more than anything in the world. But try as he might, he couldn't get past anyone in the recruitment centers, no matter how many attempts he made. Steve had never been a big guy. Growing up on the streets of Brooklyn, New York, he and his best friend James "Bucky" Barnes had gotten into their fair share of fights. But it was usually Bucky who managed to keep them safe. Steve was scrappy, but physically he wasn't anything to write home about. He was skinny and frail, and because of his asthma, he couldn't even do enough exercise to add some muscles. He also had other health problems. The list was so long, doctors usually thought he was making some of them up. But that was the last thing in the world Steve Rogers was going to do. He would never have done anything to be fit in the army, for the army. Not every soldier had to be a muscle man like Johnny Weissmuller or Charles Atlas. You could win wars with brains and heart. Steve had enough brains, he figured, and he had a big heart. Some army recruitment centers would eventually give him what he wanted most, a 1A stamp. Then he could be a U.S. soldier like his father had been, which is why he now stood in line in the 5th recruitment center in the 5th city, hoping this would be the day. He knew it was not exactly legal to try and enlist in multiple locations, but so far, no one seemed to have caught on. "Roger Stephen," a voice called out, startling Steve. He stepped forward, wiping his hands nervously on his pants. The doctor opened his file and began to scan it. "Father died of mustard gas," Steve said. He wasn't sad about it anymore. He was proud of his father's service, and he kept his head high as he said it. He was with the 107th Infantry. "I was hoping I could be assigned, Mother." This one hurt a little more. "She was a nurse in the TB ward," Steve said. "Got hit. Couldn't shake it." Not that anyone ever shook tuberculosis. Not really. Steve had been an orphan for a while now, but he was doing all right on his own. The doctor kept going through the file, his eyes growing wide as he took in all the alignments that had been checked off. The paper looked like it had been attacked by a red pen. Just give me a chance, Steve said. "Sorry, son," the doctor said, looking up at him. "You're ineligible on your asthma alone." He didn't say it, but Steve knew he was thinking, "You're a fool, kid. The war is for strong men, not for guys like you, not for guys who can't even breathe right." "You can't do anything?" Steve asked anyway, hope in his voice. "I'm doing it," the doctor answered. "I'm saving your life." Then, as Steve watched the door, the doctor pulled out a dreaded stamp. With a resounding thunk, he pressed it down on the file, marking it with a big black 4F. Steve had failed. Again. A short while later, Steve was back in Brooklyn, inside a darkened movie theater. Up on the screen, images from the front lines flashed in a newsreel. There was a picture of a bombed-out town, followed by images of soldiers pulling wounded men out of the line of fire. Another image showed the enemy marching into an undefended town, knocking down people and buildings as they went. Nearby, Steve heard Nearby, Steve heard the unmistakable sound of someone crying. So many people had already lost loved ones or were about to send them off to the front lines. Steve didn't have anybody who would miss him if he went. His parents were gone, and his closest friend, Bucky, had already enlisted and was being shipped off the next day. Bucky would be over in Europe in no time, doing his part for the war effort, while Steve stayed behind, useless. The sound of an angry voice broke through Steve's thoughts. "Who cares? Play the movie already," someone shouted from behind him. Steve's eyes narrowed. What kind of guy would say something like that at a time like this? He turned in his seat and tried to see who had spoken, but the screen had gone dark for a moment, and it was difficult to make out anyone in the shadows. "Can you keep it down, please?" he asked quietly, hoping that the person with the bad attitude would hear him. But apparently he didn't, because a moment later the guy called out, "Let 'em clean up their own mess." Steve shot out of his seat. He had enough. "You want to shut up, pal?" he asked, turning around. Then Steve's eyes grew wide. In the light of the screen, he could now see who was talking. The guy was huge, and he looked way too eager to fight. Steve gulped. What had he gotten himself into? In the alley behind the theater, Steve stood with his fists in front of him, balancing on the balls of his feet. He bobbed and weaved from side to side, trying to look tough, but the other guy was easily double his size, with the fist size of Steve's head. The big guy advanced toward Steve, who leaped forward, hitting him with an uppercut and then getting a good punch into his kidney. The hit made the man flinch, but only for a moment. He came back at Steve, swinging his meaty fists. Steve ducked one punch and then another. He stepped lightly on the back and out of the way as the guy swung again. Smiling, Steve tried to get another hit in, but then his luck ran out. He tried to punch the guy, but got too close, and in one move, the big man knocked Steve flat with a roundhouse right. Steve got up and came after him again, and the big guy knocked him down again. This time, Steve had a split lip. He spat blood on the alley bricks and got his guard up again. "You just don't know when to give up, do you?" the big guy said. "I can do this all day," Steve panted. Struggling to get back on the wind that had been knocked out of him, Steve unsteadily got to his feet. He shook his head, trying to clear his vision. The guy let out a mean laugh. He made a fist, pulled back his arm, and just as he went to swing, someone grabbed his bicep, stopping him and momentarily saving Steve. "Hey, pick on someone your own size." Steve opened his eyes, which he had shut in anticipation of the punch, and smiled. He knew that voice. Bucky had arrived. It wasn't the first time Bucky had bailed out his best friend. He smiled as he spoke to the meathead, but it wasn't a friendly smile. When he let the guy's arm go, the guy took a swing at him. Bucky slipped the punch and ducked him, careful not to mess up his spotless dress uniform. The smile never left his face. The guy headed for the mouth of the alley. Bucky gave him a swift kick in the behind to make sure he went a little faster. The grin on his face got more friendly as he took Steve in. "Sometimes I think you like getting punched," he said. Making his way over to Steve, Bucky helped him to his feet. Then he reached down to pick up a slip of paper that had fallen out of Steve's jacket. Seeing what it was, he stifled a groan. It was another recruitment slip. He knew how much his friend wanted to be a soldier, but he also knew that it was probably not going to happen. And while Bucky would never say anything out loud, it made him sort of mad. True, he wanted to help his country win the war, but he was going to be shipped out tomorrow, and he was nervous. He didn't know what to expect across the ocean, and part of him wished he had the same excuse Steve did. Sighing, he handed the slip of paper back to Steve. "Now you're from Paramus?" he asked. You know it's illegal to lie on an enlistment form, don't you?" Steve shrugged. You get your orders, he asked. Bucky couldn't possibly understand what it was like to be him. Even now, standing in the dirty alley, Bucky looked like a hero. Something Steve could never be. Sergeant James Barnes shipping out for England first thing tomorrow. He saw that cut into Steve a little, and he felt bad about it. Seeing the sadness in Steve's eyes, Bucky decided to drop the subject. Time was precious now, and it seemed silly to waste it, being in a bad mood. He had another idea. "Come on, man. My last night. Gotta get you cleaned off." "Why?" Steve asked. "Where are we going?" "The future," Bucky said, holding up a newspaper. He smiled. On the front page was a picture of a fairgrounds with a headline that read, 1942 World Exhibition of Tomorrow. Steve raised a curious eyebrow. Bucky wanted to go to a fair. Now, shrugging, he followed his friend out of the alley. Maybe going to see an exhibition about tomorrow would help him forget all about today. Chapter 2. A few hours later, Bucky and Steve made their way into the fairgrounds. At some point, Bucky had managed to find 2 young ladies to accompany them and was busy trying to get Steve to talk with one of them. But it wasn't working. Steve was too busy taking in the sights, particularly the modern marvels pavilion. The fairgrounds looked like something out of a science fiction novel. Huge futuristic buildings had been erected, and they stood alongside smaller tents and pavilions. High above the ground, a monorail silently glided by, carrying passengers from one end of the exposition to the other. People of all ages wandered around, their eyes wide and open at various sights. Steve had to admit, it was pretty amazing. Making their way further into the fair, Steve and Bucky noticed a commotion over to one side. Walking closer, they saw a big sign that read, Stark Industries, whatever. Standing on a raised platform next to a very expensive car was a man. Steve recognized from the papers. Howard Stark. He was a millionaire inventor and a notorious playboy who was always photographed out on the town with a beautiful woman on his arm. Right now, he was giving some kind of spiel about gravitic reversion technology, whatever that was. What if I told you that in a few short years, your car won't even have to touch the ground at all? He called out over the crowd. There were some catcalls and some cheers. As they watched, Stark smiled and pulled a lever. Suddenly, the car lifted up off the ground. It was floating and its wheels moved so they were parallel to the ground. The audience oohed and awed, taking in the sight of the car tomorrow. But then a series of loud pops and a shower of sparks came out of the wells, and the car dropped back to the ground, shaking the platform. Stark just smiled again and began talking about how not even he was perfect. Well, I did say a few years, didn't I? He said, spreading his arms and with the kind of smile that he'd be right back at it again tomorrow. Turning to say something to Steve, Bucky noticed that his friend was no longer by his side. Even Steve's date didn't know where he had gone. Sighing, Bucky went to look for him. He found Steve standing in front of the one non-futuristic pavilion in the entire fair, the U.S. Army recruitment booth. It looked empty. No one wanted to think about war now, not even when they could think about all the amazing things the future held. No one but Steve Rogers. He stood staring at the tent, enraptured. You're really going to do this now? Bucky asked, walking over to stand next to him. I'm going to try my luck, Steve said, nodding. As who? Bucky said, his voice harsh. Steve from Ohio? They'll catch you. Or worse, they'll actually take you. That was it. Bucky had enough. He was leaving for England tomorrow, and his best friend in the world wouldn't take the night off to have some fun with him, talk with some pretty girls, and maybe have a dance or two. It was the first time Bucky had ever voiced his fears about Steve fighting in the war. Steve was taken aback by his friend's honesty. This isn't a back alley scrap, Steve, Bucky continued, his voice softening. It's a war. No, Steve corrected. It's the war. The war we can't lose. This one is the one that counts, and I mean to be counted. Steve took a step forward toward the tent, and Bucky put a hand on his arm as one of the girls called out, Hey, Bucky, are we going dancing or what? We sure are, Bucky called back. Come on, he said to Steve. It's my last night. His friend turned and gave him a wry smile. There was nothing Bucky could say or do that would convince Steve to leave the pavilion. Holding out his hand, he and Steve shook. It was time to say goodbye. Don't do anything stupid until I get back, Bucky said. How can I? You're taking all the stupid with you, Steve said. Don't win the war till I get there. Then he walked away toward the tent. Bucky watched his friend go, his heart heavy. He hoped for Steve's sake that he would get what he wanted. He just wasn't convinced that when Steve got it, it would make him happy. There was part of Steve that knew he was being ridiculous. How many more times could he fail? It was Bucky's last night, but if there was even the slimmest chance that his luck could change, then he had to take it. Walking inside the recruitment center, he was directed to an examination room. His eyes quickly adjusted to the dark, where outside it was all bright lights and noisy crowds. Inside, it was quiet and somber. Out of the corner of his eye, Steve saw an older man come in. He looked tired, as though being there took all his energy. The man made his way slowly over to Steve. "So, you want to go overseas? Be a hero?" he asked in a German accent. Steve just looked at him. He wasn't sure what to say. Was this some kind of test? "Dr. Abraham Erskine," the man said, introducing himself. "Strategic Scientific Reserve, U.S. Army." Steve had never heard of the Strategic Scientific Reserve, but figured there were a lot of things he hadn't heard of. Shrugging, he gave Erskine his name and looked on as the man found his file. Steve tried not to grimace when once again he saw all the red X's marking each and every one of his alignments and weaknesses. "Where are you from?" he asked, to draw the doctor's attention away from the file. "Queens," Erskine said. He paused and added, "Before that, Germany. This bothers you?" Steve was momentarily taken back. Was this place legit? He hadn't expected a German national to be inside a U.S. Army recruitment center. Then again, wasn't Einstein German too? "No," he said, but he hesitated at first. It didn't seem to bother Erskine. Probably he'd heard it all before. He finished reviewing the file and then looked up. "Where are you from, Mr. Rogers?" "Yes. New Haven, or is it?" He glanced down at the file again. "Paramus, Newark, 5 exams and 5 tries in 5 different cities," he said. "All failed. You are very tenacious, yes?" How did he know that? Steve wondered. He'd thought that by going to different cities he could stay under the radar and the Army wouldn't see how desperate he was to enlist. Maybe the Strategic Scientific Reserve, whatever it was, had more intel than the other branches of the Army. Outside, a pair of men wandered by and turned when they heard Erskine's German accent. They took a step forward as though to do something when Steve held a warning hand. Figuring it wasn't worth it, they moved on. "A fella has to stand up," Steve said, turning back to Erskine. "I don't like bullies, Doc. I don't care where they're from." The old man nodded thoughtfully. "So you would fight, yes?" he said. "But you are weak and you are very small." Steve was about to protest when Erskine did something unexpected. He laid out Steve's file on the table and picked up a stamp. Steve's heart began to beat faster. "I can offer you a chance," Dr. Erskine said. "Only a chance." Then, as Steve watched with growing excitement, the man pressed the stamp down on the file. Holding up the file, Steve saw a big 1A. He couldn't believe it. After all this time, he was actually in the Army. His luck had changed, just like he told Bucky it would. As Erskine began to talk about next steps, Steve tried to pay attention, but his mind was spinning. He had no idea what kind of group the SSR was, or why they would okay someone like him. Should he be worried? Was Bucky right when he said the biggest danger would come if someone did let him in? What if this was all some sort of joke? Maybe when he got outside, he'd see Bucky laughing, having pulled a fast one on his old friend. Shaking off those thoughts, Steve focused on Erskine. Whatever the SSR was, and whatever the reason they had for taking him, Steve didn't care. He was in. Soon he would be a real soldier, and maybe, someday, even an American hero. Chapter 3. Steve Rogers wasn't the only one chosen by the Strategic Scientific Reserve. A few days later, he found himself standing in line at Camp Leahy in the practice field with 11 other recruits. They were all healthy and tall and strong, and next to them, Steve felt even smaller than he usually did. But that didn't stop him from signing the last will and testament document without a moment's hesitation, while the other recruits were all nervous about signing their lives away. Steve was willing to give all that he could to the U.S. Army, even if it meant his own life. Steve and the rest of the recruits filed into a large room where Steve spied a man and a woman watching and waiting. The man scowled at Steve, who was waiting to see Dr. Erskine off to one side, observing the recruits. The other man then introduced himself as Colonel Chester Phillips. He stood ramrod straight, multiple medals shining on his uniform. Deep lines were etched on his face, marking the combat missions that he had survived. Yet his eyes were still bright, clear, and serious as they surveyed the room. Colonel Phillips addressed the men. The Strategic Scientific Reserve is an allied effort made up of the best minds in the free world, he began. With that, the colonel then introduced Dr. Erskine and Agent Peggy Carter, who was on loan to the Army from the British intelligence and despite her obvious beauty, looked only slightly less intimidating than Colonel Phillips. When Agent Carter began to speak, Steve noticed there was a lot of quiet chuckling and chattering going on. The recruits kept eyeing Peggy, taking in her long legs and pretty face. They also questioned why they were being addressed by a British officer. I thought I was sending it for the U.S. Army, one of them said. Agent Carter stopped talking and zeroed in on him. Steve had just met him. He was a big, raw-boned blonde guy named Hodge. "What's your name, soldier?" she asked Hodge. Hodge told her. "Put your right foot forward," she instructed him. "Why? What kind of move is a dame gonna teach me?" Hodge asked, loud enough for the whole group of recruits to hear. Peggy decked him with a straight right to the nose. Then she straightened herself, cool and collected, while Hodge started to get up. Blood ran from his nose. "Agent Carter," Colonel said. She came to attention. "Colonel Phillips?" "I can see you're breaking in the candidates," the colonel said. He gave Hodge a hard glance as Hodge got to his feet and back in the muster line. "That's good." The breaking in didn't stop there. It was only getting started. First was the obstacle course. As he stood waiting for his team's turn, Steve tried to remember everything he had read about obstacle courses. He knew that they were supposed to help a soldier learn how to handle combat situations while building a sense of team camaraderie, but looking out over the various objects of the course and then taking in the men standing on either side of him, he doubted that would happen. The obstacles included a climbing wall, rope swings, rappelling wall, a long piece of wood that looked like a balance beam but with a rough surface, large rubber tires, and even a deep mud puddle. The men already on the course raced through the obstacles, easily climbing over the wall and nimbly running across the balance beam. It looked as if they had been doing this sort of thing their whole lives. "Our goal is to create the finest army in history," Colonel Phillips said as they waited, "but every army starts with one man. By the end of this week, we're going to choose that man. He's going to be the first of a new breed of super soldiers." "Super soldiers?" Steve repeated silently. Was there something going on he didn't know about? But he didn't have time to think about it as a horn sounded, signaling his turn to go. He leaped at the wall, trying to pull himself over, but one of the other men's boots landed squarely on his head, pushing him back. By the time he made it over, he was behind the others. He could see Phillips, Peggy, and Erskine watching and increased his speed. But he knew that he'd already made a bad impression. He had to pick up his game. Erskine turned to Phillips, and his mind made up. "Rogers is the clear choice," he told the colonel. But Phillips couldn't disagree more. You put a needle in that guy's arm," the colonel began. "It's going to come out the other side." Phillips continued to watch Steve, who was once again the last in line. "Look at him," Phillips said to Erskine. "He's making me cry." But the course continued, and so did Steve. He scrambled up the cargo net only to get tangled in it when Hodge walked over him. But he recovered and kept going. He crawled through the mud covered by barbed wire only to have Hodge stick out a support beam, causing the barbed wire to fall on Steve. Still, he kept going. His efforts didn't go unnoticed. Agent Carter and Dr. Erskine had seen Hodge try to sabotage Steve over and over again, and yet each time Steve had gotten back up and more determined than ever. He didn't have the muscles or the other recruits, but he had something they didn't: heart. He would fight as hard as he could, as long as he could never turn back on a fellow soldier. Those were the qualities Peggy and Erskine were looking for. Phillips, however, didn't feel the same way. He still saw Steve as a weak, ineffectual soldier in training. Phillips wanted Hodge for the job and wasted no time in voicing his opinion. He's big, he's fast, he takes orders. In short, he's a soldier. No, Erskine interjected. He's a bully. Phillips immediately encountered Erskine's argument. You don't win wars with niceness, Doctor. You win them with guts. And to prove his point, Phillips picked up a grenade and hurled it in the middle of the course, right near Steve. As Hodge and the other recruits panicked and fled, Steve ran right on the grenade. Everybody down! And he shouted as he flung on top of the explosive device. There was a moment of silence as everyone waited for the inevitable. 1 second passed, 2 seconds, 3. Finally, Steve gingerly eased himself up and off the grenade. Looking over to where Phillips, Peggy, and Erskine stood, he cocked his head and asked, "Is this a test?" Peggy tried not to smile. It was a test of sorts, and not even Colonel Phillips could deny that Steve had passed. Erskine cocked an eyebrow at the colonel. "He's still skinny," Phillips growled, but he didn't argue anymore. The SSR didn't need to look any further. Steve Rogers was going to be their first super soldier. Later that night, Steve sat alone inside the barracks. The rest of the recruits had sent home, and the empty beds made Steve feel even more alone. But part of him was excited about what the future held. Peggy and Dr. Erskine had given him more details once he was chosen. He was to be given a special serum that Erskine had created. With luck, it would turn him into a man with extraordinary powers. He'd be able to run faster, hit harder, and think quicker. All the things that would be helpful on the battlefield. But there would also be risks in undergoing such procedure. Namely, would he survive the experiment? The sound of footsteps echoed in the empty room, and Steve looked up. Erskine had entered the barracks and was still walking toward him. As always, the doctor's expression was somber. "Can I ask you a question?" Steve asked when the older man took a seat on the bed across from him. Erskine nodded. "Why me?" The doctor smiled. He had been expecting this question, and Steve deserved to know the answer, and the history behind the serum. 5 years ago, Erskine began. He was living in Germany working as a scientist. His experiments were radical, and some felt they were foolish. But then he had invented a serum that had the possibility of giving a man almost superhuman abilities. It promised great power to anyone who controlled it, and as the war was just beginning, the potential for whoever had it to be victorious. Erskine was eager to keep it out of the wrong hands, but then a man named Johann Schmidt found out about his discovery. Schmidt, Erskine explained, was himself a brilliant scientist and also the leader of an organization called Hydra. At the time that Erskine worked with him, Schmidt was fascinated with occult powers and Teutonic myths. So was Hitler. Steve knew that, but Schmidt wasn't a true believer, a real Nazi. He longed for his own glory, no matter what the cost. Schmidt believed that the worlds existed in which men had the strength of gods and could control the elements. He became obsessed with the idea that great power had been hidden on Earth by the gods and was waiting to be seized by a superior man. Schmidt and Hydra vowed for that power. Steve raised an eyebrow, and Erskine nodded at it as if to say, "Yes, insane, I know." Then he continued. Schmidt believed that Erskine's serum was the key to that power, and he wanted it. Despite Erskine's every attempt to stop him, Schmidt got his hands on the sham serum and in an act of desperation, injected himself. The results were horrific, and the experiment was a failure. Erskine had no choice. He fled his country and made his way to the United States in hope of keeping the rest of the serum out of Schmidt's hands. But he knew the Hydra leader would never stop looking for him, or the serum. The failed experiment had corrupted Schmidt, and in Erskine's eyes it had turned the scientist into a monster. "This is why you were chosen," Erskine said to Steve, who had been listening intently. "A strong man, he might lose respect for power if he had all his life, but a weak man knows the value of strength and compassion." The scientist sighed deeply. He saw the doubt in Steve's eyes and couldn't blame him. It was a rather unbelievable story, but it was an important one, for Erskine had learned a valuable lesson. "The serum amplifies what is inside," he finished. "Good becomes great, bad becomes worse." Erskine looked Steve straight in the eyes. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, Promise me you'll stay who you are. Not a perfect soldier, but a good man." Steve nodded in silence. Tomorrow was going to be a very interesting day. He just hoped that Erskine and Peggy were right about him. He didn't want to think about what would happen if they were wrong. Okay, so that is Captain America the Winter Soldier, chapters 1 through 3. I'm sorry it was so long, but I hope you enjoyed it. Love you guys.